Shalom and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this program today, we'll be discussing the 50th anniversary of the Six-Day War and the liberation and unification of Jerusalem. And a warm welcome to the programme, and to discuss the 50th anniversary of the Six-Day War, I'm joined by my good friend Stephen Jaffe. Stephen, welcome back to the Middle East Report.
Thank you very much for having me, Simon, and for this opportunity to discuss the 50th anniversary of the Six-Day War. It's a tremendous year of anniversaries. We've got the centenary of the Balfour Declaration, of course, but also the 50th anniversary of the Six-Day War and the liberation of Jerusalem.
Absolutely, which is a very fascinating subject. Stephen, I'm going to ask you my first question to you is, what is the Jewish community doing? Because I know that you're here today representing the Board of Deputies and the Jewish Leadership Council to mark the 50th anniversary of the Six-Day War and the liberation of Jerusalem.
So we have a very specific initiative, Simon. It's on Twitter and it's also on Facebook. It's the Six-Day War 50 years on, and what we're going to be doing from the middle of May, from the 15th of May to the middle of June, every day we're going to be posting a news story about the Six-Day War, what was happening in the Middle East at the time, what was the crisis that Israel was facing, what was the threats that were being made about Israel, and how did Israel respond. We're also going to be looking in this Facebook and Twitter initiative on how did it impact on the UK, in particular on the Jewish community, because this was a very traumatic period. Some of our older members of our community, of course, remember it very well indeed. They felt that Israel was facing another Holocaust. The threats emanating from the Arab world were ones of genocide. We were going to destroy Israel. We were going to eradicate the Israeli people. And this obviously had a major traumatic impact on the Jewish people around the world as well as in Israel. So the point of the initiative, both on Facebook and on Twitter, is to ensure that people can see the crisis as it happened, and it's a very fast moving crisis, and to learn about the conduct of the war, its impact both in Israel, the Middle East, and here in the UK. So it's an exciting initiative, and I'm very pleased that the Board of Deputies of British Jews and the Jewish Leadership Council have come together to promote it, also with the assistance of the Jewish Chronicle, which is the main Jewish newspaper in the UK.
Excellent, that's great news. Why is it so important that we remember the 50th anniversary of the Six-Day War?
Because I think, Simon, there's a lot of untruthful information out there concerning the war. People will say that Israel and Zionism was expansionist, that this was a deliberate war that Israel inflicted on its Arab neighbours to expand its territory and to displace Arab people. That is the opposite of the truth, and you can only, I think, counter that by understanding the facts as they took place day by day during that crucial period from the middle of May to the middle of June in 1967, when Israel faced threats of annihilation. And so this was not a war that Israel inflicted on its neighbours, quite the reverse. We'll explain in the initiative the lengths that Israel went to avoid conflict, to use diplomacy to try and avoid war. And yet these lies about the Six-Day War are still being told, still being peddled in books and in mainstream media, that Israel deliberately started the war, that it was a war of aggression and expansion. And I think we need to nail those kind of lies on the head.
Absolutely. So let's start by looking at the Six-Day War with Israel's greatest spokesman, Abri Ban, who was Israel's foreign secretary during the start of the Six-Day War. And this is his account of how the war of June 1967, known as the Six-Day War, started.
The 11 years that had elapsed since the 1956 year were the most tranquil, the most peaceful, the most fertile and progressive years in our history. Our economy flourished. Immigration had increased. Our international position was broadening year by year. As foreign minister, I presided over 91 Israeli embassies in all the 5 continents of the world. We wanted nothing except the continuation of that movement of consolidation.
But Syrian air raids in the north in April 1967 reminded us that tranquility had not been achieved. Syrian shelling of our border kibbutzim from the Golan Heights told the same story. In May, these tensions increased as the Soviet Union fed false reports to President Nasser of Egypt of an imminent Israeli attack on Syria. Nasser responded by ordering his troops to move into Sinai after he had demanded the removal of United Nations forces. Soon after came his most dramatic move. Nasser declared a naval blockade of the Straits of Tiran, cutting off our approaches to East Africa and Asia, and denying our access to Persian Gulf oil.
Israel's port city of Eilat, one of the Middle East hottest spots, following a blockade of the Gulf of Aqaba by the United Arab Republic. 10 years ago, Israel went to war over the same blockade.
Egypt had placed Israel in a stranglehold. The wheels of war had been set in motion as Nasser announced to the world, "The Straits of Tiran are part of our territorial waters. No Israeli ship will ever navigate it again."
Therefore, one link after another creates the chain. Soviet incitement, Syrian hypochondria, and Egypt almost reluctantly drawn into the fray. But having been drawn in, they become intoxicated by their success, by the lack of international resistance, by rumors that Israel, no longer under Ben-Gurion, but under Levi Eshkol, is very unlikely to respond either to the blockade or to troop concentrations. That is the story of the Six-Day War, the most unwanted war in Israel's history.
The blockade was a blatant act of war. If Nasser got away with this, he could commit aggression against us at will. Now, threats about total annihilation were being broadcast daily from Arab capitals. Israel prepared for the very worst. In Tel Aviv, air raid shelters were opened. Hospitals organized for mass casualties. Kibbutzim fortified. Friends and relatives abroad offered to take our children. There was fear in the land and dread of a new Holocaust. When I asked our chief of staff what we diplomats could do, he said nervously, "Oh, time. Give us time to move our forces south and prepare for war." How to react? That was the central issue, which we so passionately debated in the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, following Nasser's actions and the Arab threats. It was vital for us in the Israeli government, and especially for me as foreign minister, to explore every alternative avenue before committing the nation to war. Our government now asked me to go to Washington to rally the support of President Johnson and meet with other Western leaders. The meeting with de Gaulle was crucial. France was our principal supplier of weapons and aircraft and had been our firm ally since the 50s. De Gaulle's words before I even sat down were, "Oh, ne faites pas la guerre," do not make war. He didn't see the blockade as an act of war. He gave me fully to understand that he feared and believed that an Egyptian-Israeli war would not be isolated or contained, but that it would expand into some cataclysmic global disaster. And so I looked at him again, our greatest friend, who had sustained us for the whole of the past decade, and I understood that de Gaulle had abandoned us. In London, I met Prime Minister Harold Wilson, who was far more sympathetic.
It is the view of Her Majesty's government in the United Kingdom that the Straits of Tiran must be regarded as an international waterway through which the vessels of all nations have a right of passage.
Can you tell us what you discussed with the Prime Minister?
Well, I think everybody knows what the main subject that preoccupies both the British government and the Israeli government today is. It's the situation created by what we say is the illegal decision to blockade the Straits of Tiran and the Gulf of Aqaba.
The government of the United States is deeply concerned, in particular with three...
President Johnson was committed to keeping the Straits of Tiran open, but I knew that the Vietnam War had weakened his authority. He said to me, "You are the victims of aggression, and I would like to break the blockade with an international force. Israel will not be alone unless it decides to be alone." As I flew home, my impressions were clear. It was doubtful if we would get naval help, but President Johnson would not stand in the way of any actions that we might take alone.
And those were the events and a personal account from Abu Ban, who was Israel's foreign minister at the time of the Six-Day War. Stephen, I just love that series called Israel, Birth of a Nation, narrated by Abu Ban, who tells the history of Israel through his eyes, and by far the most eloquent spokesman Israel's ever had, and such an asset to the country, particularly in terms of Israel's relationship with the world and the international community. When we discuss the Six-Day War, isn't it very important that we put it in its historical narrative, and particularly the likes of the Egyptians and the Syrians were backed up powerfully by the Soviet Union, and Israel was on the side of the West in this struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union for dominance and power of the world at the time. And doesn't this explain why, for example, the Soviets spent so much money to actually build up Nasser's forces, that he felt with Soviet support that he could annihilate the state of Israel and drive the Jews into the sea?
Well, the Soviet Union had a crucial role in the origins of the Six-Day War. Abba Eban touched on it when he said that the Soviets passed false information to Nasser to say that Israel was about to invade Syria. Now, that wasn't true, and Israel repeatedly said, "Come and visit the Syrian front. You'll find there isn't a single, division of the Israeli Defense Force on the Syrian border. That this is lies." But the Egyptians chose to believe it. Also, in terms of military hardware, the Arabs were actually, in terms of their air force and in terms of their heavy armaments, they were outstripping Israel in terms of the quantity, and they believed the quality of military hardware, and that was coming from the Soviet Union. So that did give Nasser a very strong sense that this was the moment that he could take Israel on. He felt that even if Israel launched an attack, that he could withstand that the tide would turn. They had, I think, 3 fighter planes to every 1 Israeli plane, 3 tanks for every 1 Israeli tank, that they could withstand that, and that they would. This was their great reckoning with Israel. Israel was going to be destroyed. And I just want to touch on something which Abba Eban didn't really refer to, and that is the extent of the rhetoric coming from the Arab capitals. King Faisal of Saudi Arabia was in London in 1967. He was on a state visit. He was a visitor with the Queen because he was an ally of the United Kingdom, and they wanted him to buy lots of British defence equipment. While he was in London, King Faisal told a television audience that it was the priority of every Arab nation to exterminate Israel, and the word he used was exterminate. He wasn't, when he said that, he wasn't suggested that he might not be a welcome guest of the United Kingdom. They just ignored it. But that level of genocidal incitement against Israel, obviously, and we're only talking about 20 odd years after the Holocaust itself, what resonated very strongly both in Israel itself, the wider Jewish world. This was their motivation. It wasn't nothing to do with settlements or occupation of the West Bank, because the so-called West Bank was not in Israeli hands at the time. This was about the destruction of Israel and the complete destruction of the people living there. The then head of the PLO, a man called Ahmed Shukri, said that the Jews would have to leave Palestine, but he believed none would survive the coming war. In other words, he foresaw a complete wiping out of the Jewish population. And we should not forget that sheer level of provocation, of hatred, of a desire, a genocidal desire against Israel.
Absolutely, but I think I've got another news clip from the time from Abriban that actually shows the Arab rhetoric at the time, where they did call for the annihilation of Israel and the Jewish people. But we have to also look at the geopolitical facts of the time, that Nasser was the aggressor here. Nasser blocked the Straits of Tehran. Nasser forced the UN peacekeepers who were in the Sinai out of the Sinai, and then deployed Egyptian troops, weapons, tanks and missiles into the Sinai, breaking the UN resolution at the time, plus also entered into a military pact where with Jordan and also Syria as well. So let's have a look at the build-up of Arab rhetoric in calling for the destruction of the State of Israel prior to the Six-Day War.
In Egypt and Syria, preparations were reaching a climax. Iraq and Saudi Arabia now pledged forces to the battle. Now Nasser declared to the Egyptian parliament, our goal is to destroy Israel.
He was preparing for it, but when to start it, we didn't know. And whether he was fully ready for that or not, we didn't know. But the whole people were excited, and they were expecting something from Nasser and his army.
King Hussein of Jordan signed a mutual defense pact with Nasser, placing his forces under Egyptian command. Now, as the Arab world united for the battle with Israel, King Hussein found himself drawn to its center. Arabs everywhere were encouraged to join the jihad, the holy war against Israel, and to avenge 1948. Wide media coverage of the Arab build-up created anguished suspense and solidarity for Israel around the world. The idea of an attack on us and the extinction of Israel was terrifying.
Large crowds saying we want to destroy Israel, the natural reaction for Israelis is to say, if that's going to happen, well, let's do something first. Rhetoric, whether it's moderate or extreme, does have either an appeasing effect or an inflammatory effect in action and not only in words.
As you can see from Abri Iban's documentary, where he talks about the build-up of the Six-Day War, you could see the anguish that he was expressing and the fear that he represented and Israel represented, that Israel faced a war of annihilation prior to the Six-Day War. Stephen, just looking at the Arab rhetoric there of Nasser and others, do you think that it was because of this rhetoric in calling for the destruction of Israel and to wipe the Jews into the sea, that this built up such a mass hysteria amongst the Arab street that Nasser had no way of actually pulling back from this war?
Well, I think there's a lot of conjecture exactly on that point. To what extent did Nasser actually want the war? But he incited his own people to such an extent by his own rhetoric. He was also provoked by other Arab states who had said in the past that although Nasser talked the talk against Israel, he hadn't actually done anything, so that he was being provoked by the Syrians, who were a very extreme and radical regime. The current president of Syria, Assad, his father, was the defense minister in Syria in '67. He was also calling for the annihilation of Israel, but goading Nasser and saying, Nasser was setting himself up to be the leader of the Arab world. He wanted to be the number one from right across North Africa and the Middle East. And they're saying, well, if that's who you want to be the Arab leader, show us that you can actually take Israel on. So he was being provoked by other Arab states. We saw there Jordan and King Hussein arriving in Cairo to enter into the defense pact with Nasser. The two men had hated each other for years. King Hussein said that Nasser had tried to assassinate him on 11 separate occasions, and yet there he was in Cairo signing a defense pact with Egypt and placing Jordanian troops under Egyptian command. And this was very significant for the Israelis because now they could see that they were entirely surrounded. In other words, Syria, Jordan and Egypt were, on the face of it, united in their determination to destroy Israel.
The other thing I think we have to discuss really is something that is key to Israel's military doctrine and that of the Israeli Defense Force, the IDF. And that is the whole concept that unlike the United States, for example, that Israel couldn't afford a war on her own territory after the horrible experience that Israel went through during the War of Independence and then high number of casualties that were killed, that in any future conflict Israel had to ensure that the battlefield was not inside Israeli territory but outside of Israeli territory. Combined with this, with Israel's preemptive strike on the 5th of June 1967 against the Egyptian Air Force, how much did this doctrine within the IDF play its role in helping Israel make up its mind that Israel had to strike first in order to protect the citizens of Israel from any invasion from the Egyptians, Jordanians and the Syrians?
Well, I think it's a very significant point, because once, for example, the Iraqi forces were deployed in Jordan, you had a build-up of Arab troops literally 20 miles from Tel Aviv. Israel at its narrowest point in 1967 was 9 miles wide. The prospect of Iraqi and Jordanian troops, remember under Egyptian command, cutting the country in two if they were to launch a surprise attack was a very real fear. So Israel was forced onto an offensive footing. And I think, yes, both the geographic size. Please bear in mind that Israel in 1967, the population of Israel was 2.6 million. It was a much smaller population than today. That's about the population of Greater Manchester. So they did not have the strategic, geographic or demographic depth to kind of soak in a first Arab strike. And of course we see that during the Yom Kippur War, when it was the Syrians and the Egyptians who launched a surprise attack on Israel, didn't have the Jordanians then, and they were also launching that attack on Yom Kippur in 1973 further back, because at that point they didn't have the Sinai or the Golan Heights. But in 1973, a surprise Arab attack on Israel was catastrophic, and Israel came close to defeat, and over 2,000 Israelis lost their lives in the Yom Kippur War. So exactly in 1967, they realized, and Moshe Dayan, who becomes Israel's defense minister just before the war, it's very much the need for a surprise, preemptive attack before Israel is invaded by the surrounding countries.
And also I think the other factor we have to bring into this is the fact that Israel had a kind of weak leadership in Levi Eshkol, who was Israel's prime minister at the time, and that unlike his predecessor, David Ben-Gurion, was very much seen as a warrior. He's the one that led Israel's War of Independence. He's the one that gained Israel's independence because of his military tactics as prime minister during that war. That the Israeli public didn't have a great deal of confidence in Levi Eshkol, did they? Is that why he appointed the war hero Moshe Dayan as his Minister of Defense a few days before the war?
So you're correct, Simon. I agree with you that Levi Eshkol as Prime Minister didn't have either a tremendous military background. He'd never been a commander in the Israeli army. He didn't have the status of an international statesman the way that Ben-Gurion, when he addressed the nation of Israel very shortly before war broke out, he failed to inspire them. He stumbled over his words. Now, what I find reading the kind of the textbook histories of the Six-Day War is that Levi Eshkol was a decent man. He was in his way a leader of his people. He tried his best to avoid war in a very decent way, but he came up against enormous pressure from the Israeli people. They saw the built-up of hatred that was emanating from the Arab countries. They felt that an invasion was imminent. They didn't believe that Eshkol was up to the task, and there was a lot of political toing and froing and wrangling between the government parties and the opposition parties. And then just before the war, Dayan comes in as Minister of Defense. Eshkol had been both Prime Minister and Minister of Defense, so he gave that defense portfolio to Dayan. Also Menachem Begin, who was the leader of the opposition in Israel, for the first time becomes a government minister of a national emergency coalition just before the outbreak of war.
So let's have a look now at the dramatic morning that took place on June the 5th, 1967.
Prime Minister Eshkol called for the vote. Each of us knew exactly what he was doing and what was to be decided. Life or death for soldiers, for citizens, who knows, perhaps for the nation itself, all this was in the balance. All hands were raised. There was no choice. Yes, we were going to war. In the early dawn of Monday, June the 5th, Israeli jets sped towards Egyptian targets. General Mordechai Hod was the commander of our Air Force. His objective was clear.
To plan the operation as such that we will hit first the most dangerous element of the Egyptian Air Force, meaning the bombers and the fighters that had enough range to reach civilian centers of Israel.
In less than 3 hours, 300 Egyptian combat fighters had been destroyed. On the same morning, a three-pronged armored attack was launched in Sinai. Our forces moved swiftly, destroying the fiercest opposition. We knew that immediate danger had been averted, but could only imagine the price that was being paid in life and blood for our safety. By the end of the second day of the war, Israeli armor had occupied the Gaza Strip, had smashed major Egyptian defense positions, and commanded all Sinai routes leading to the west and south. Nevertheless, the Egyptians began broadcasting news reports announcing immense Egyptian gains and huge Israeli losses from the first hours of June the 5th.
When the 1967 war started, I was in the University of Cairo. In the morning, I opened the radio. There were military marches being broadcasted, and the broadcaster was announcing communiques one after the other, declaring that 50, 100, 150 Israeli planes were shot down when Israel attacked Egypt. It took us more than 3 days before we realized that the war ended up with the victory of Israel.
In the very first hours after the outbreak of hostilities with Egypt, our most urgent aim was to avoid Jordan's involvement. So I drafted a letter for Prime Minister Eshkol and asked the United Nations Chief of Staff to take it urgently, immediately to Amman, calling upon Hussein to avoid becoming involved. Certain of Arab success, Jordan tragically and with disastrous consequences opened fire along the entire front and in western Jerusalem. The Jordanians caused a tremendous number of our casualties, but by Wednesday, June the 7th, Israeli forces had captured most of the West Bank. The main battle now moved to Jerusalem. Jerusalem was a divided city. The front ran through its center, separating Jerusalem into east, held by Jordan, and west, held by Israel. East Jerusalem was captured in one of the most savage battles of the war, involving tanks, infantry, and hand-to-hand combat.
I was working as a doctor in the Augusta Victoria Hospital in Jerusalem. Actually, people thought, when they saw the Israeli tanks, thought they were Iraqi tanks. And some of them went out to receive them, and, you know, very happy about it. But then, of course, they found out they were not Iraqis. Now, it was a very severe shock for all of us.
Finally, the old city was encircled. The last defending Jordanian troops trapped inside. The military were waiting for our instructions. We held a cabinet meeting in the air raid shelter of the Knesset. We weighed the capture of the old city. To protect the holy places, it would have to be taken street by street, and the battle would be costly. The order was given to commence the attack.
We were the first unit that broke into the East Jerusalem. It was a very strange feeling. It was a mixture of euphoria and a deep pain because of the losses. It was the first time that we suffered so many casualties.
Incredible historical events in fulfillment of biblical prophecy. Before we mention the liberation of Jerusalem there, and absolutely inspirational scenes there of the IDF liberating Jerusalem from the Jordanians, was the preemptive strike in terms of the Israeli Air Force, because what the Israeli Air Force achieved was unprecedented in aviation history. The fact that they carried out, 800 sorties in one day, they destroyed the entire Egyptian Air Force and also the entire Arab Air Force at the time, so they won air supremacy. How important were the first few hours, and particularly the surprise attack on the Egyptian Air Force, which meant that Israel won the Six-Day War?
It was vital, Simon. There was a lot of deception at the weekend before the war. Moshe Dayan and others gave the impression that Israel would hold out for longer and there was nothing imminent going to happen. This was absolutely crucial. The planes flew, I think, about 100 meters above ground to be under radar.
Meters, yeah.
There were no radio contact allowed between the pilots. The average age of a pilot was 23. But this was a plan that they had worked on for a long period. They all knew what to do. They had intelligence about where the Egyptian where their planes were deployed. But one of the most amazing things about that attack was the ability to turn around a plane after its initial sortie in 7.5 minutes for its second sortie. That was totally unprecedented, and it meant that even though Israel had a numerical inferiority of 1 to 3, that they were so much more effective than the other Arab air forces. Now, when Israel attacked Egypt, there were only 4 Israeli planes left behind to defend the country from Jordanian or Iraqi or Syrian aircraft attack. But they were slow in coming in defense of their Egyptian brothers. It wasn't until much later in the day that they attempted to bomb, and they did bomb Haifa and around Tel Aviv. But by that stage, the Israeli Air Force had defeated the Egyptian Air Force and was able then, as you said, to counter the other Arab air forces in Iraq, Jordan and Syria. But surprise was the vital factor.
Tell us about the miracle that took place in terms of the Egyptians not having their anti-aircraft guns ready.
So this is a tested fact, Simon, that at the time that Israel struck, it was about 7:45 on the Monday morning, Egypt's very sophisticated anti-aircraft system was switched off. The reason being that the Field Marshal, the head of the Egyptian army, the Deputy Prime Minister of Iraq, I think, and other Arab VIPs were flying across the Sinai that morning, and they didn't want to be accidentally shot down. So they were commanded to switch off the aircraft defense systems just at the moment that Israel struck. And this is phenomenal. Another thing that happened is, and these are pilots, are very secular-minded pilots, they said that there was a lot of haze, a lot of mist particularly around the Suez Canal when they were striking, but that mist rose. And you can see how people of faith and of a biblical perspective in this see both the threat against Israel, that genocidal threat, as a recurring biblical theme, isn't it? So if you think of the Purim story and the sense of deliverance in such a short period of time, 2 hours, the war was, to all intents and purposes, won. A miraculous turnaround of events.
Absolutely. And also when the war then transferred to Syria, and the incredible military feat that the IDF had to overcome in order to get up onto the Golan Heights and defeat the Syrians on the Golan was nothing short than a miracle. But a lot of credit goes to, I can't remember his name, but I know his surname was Cohen, the famous Israeli spy. And I remember being, as part of my Hebrew University of Jerusalem program, that we went up to the Golan Heights and we're told the story of I can't remember his first name. Eli, that's right, Eli Cohen. And that Eli Cohen had identified as a spy because he was a taxi driver in Damascus. He was asking questions of these officials, and the officials told him that in any preparation for a war against Israel, that they would hide their tanks and heavy artillery behind the eucalyptus trees, and these would protect their tanks and weapons. And the fact that Israeli intelligence got that information to the Israeli government meant they decided to bomb all the eucalyptus trees up on the Golan Heights, which resulted in the rout of the Syrian army. And surely that's one of the other miracles of the Six-Day War.
Well, intelligence was a major factor, and they did know in tremendous detail people like Eli Cohen, both in Egypt and in Syria. They paid it with their lives as spies, but the level of Israeli intelligence was of a very, very high order. Again, this is so necessary when you look at the difference in populations, in the size of their armed forces. Intelligence is crucial, and this is obviously something that Israel has always prided itself in, whether it's through Mossad or individual agents, their ability to get that intelligence of crucial importance in the conduct of the Six-Day War and Israel's security generally.
So now let's have a look at that incredible liberation of Jerusalem that occurred during the Six-Day War of June 1967.
And the unbelievable had happened. After 19 years of absence, and after great pain and loss, Israel had returned to the heart of Jerusalem. In Israel, after the Six-Day War, a mass euphoria engulfed the nation.
And those were those incredible historic moments when Jerusalem became liberated and fell back into Israeli sovereignty. I have to ask you, Stephen, what was the impact of the liberation of Jerusalem, not only to Israel, but also to world Jewry, including Anglo Jewry?
Well, very, very significant. If you can imagine, for diaspora Jewish communities looking on and seeing the threat that Israel was under. During the first day of the war itself, there was lots of false news coming out that Israel had actually fallen, that its attack had been beaten back, and that Israel was facing utter defeat. So from that sense of utter dejection to when the truth came out, to elation was massive. And as part of this, the reunification of Jerusalem. Jews had not been allowed to visit the old city of Jerusalem since 1948. The Western Wall had been out of bounds to the Jewish people. The sense of euphoria that they were back in Jewish sovereignty, not for the first time since 1948, of course, for the first time since 2,000 years. And on the festival of Shavuot, of Pentecost, which was the week following the war, over 200,000 Israelis and Jews from around the world visited Jerusalem, the first pilgrim festival of its kind since biblical times. So this was amazing. Now, in terms of the British Jewish community and what it was going through and how it responded, I think it's quite a significant story and not really ever been told, I think. They filled the Royal Albert Hall. There were over 10,000 people at a demonstration of solidarity for Israel. They had a rally and a march. It started at Hyde Park. It passed the Israeli embassy, again, of solidarity, and thousands attended that as well. More volunteers left the United Kingdom to Israel during the war period than from any other country. Not as combatants generally, but as to work on kibbutzim, on the farms, to work in industry, to take the places of those Israeli reservists who had, of course, been called up. And hundreds of young Jews, many of them unaffiliated, many of them who had perhaps not been to synagogue for many years. There was a great sense of reawakening of their Jewish identity, a unity and coming together of the Jewish community, not just in the UK, but across the world. Particularly significant, actually, in the Soviet Union, where you had millions of Jews living under Soviet oppression, a very anti-Zionist regime where if you taught Hebrew to your children, that could be a prison sentence. If you were to say next year in Jerusalem, of course, a great Jewish saying from the Passover that again could give rise to a prison sentence. Saying that you wanted to go and live in Israel was a crime. The Six-Day War and people like Natan Sharansky, who's a very prominent Russian Jew at that time, says that Israel was not just fighting for its own survival, it was fighting for the dignity and self-respect for every Jew around the world. So there was a massive impact psychologically on the Jewish communities in Britain and across the world.
Excellent. So we'll have some original pictures taken from the Western Wall during the time of the liberation of Jerusalem from the Jordanians. We'll have some pictures coming up in a moment to show you. Stephen, I think the next thing, I think it had a tremendous impact on evangelical Christians as well at the time. There we go. This is probably one of the most famous pictures of Israeli soldiers, paratroopers, looking up at the Hakot al-Hamaravi, the Western Wall. There we see Moshe Dayan approaching the Western Wall, and there's an Israeli military general looking out. And so this is one of the fighters in the desert.
Yeah, these are reservist soldiers, middle-aged men. You can see these are the commanders on the Sinai Desert. You've got Sharon there. Yeah, a young Sharon.
Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Having a look at those original archive pictures. Going back to the role of the impact it had on Christian Zionists, I think it had a profound impact upon Christian Zionists because before their eyes they saw the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. Here we are, the Jewish people are back in their land, and then a war that Israel didn't want, a war of annihilation, and Israel triples territory in 6 days, which was incredible feat in military history that Israel defeated 3 of her enemies in 6 days. And the other profound impact was that after the 6-day war, this is when the Americans started to support Israel, because prior to the 6-day war, Israel had received a few weapons from, I think it was JFK's administration, but not much. Lyndon B. Johnson supported Israel diplomatically, but it was after the 6-day war that the Americans realized that Israel was a great asset in the Middle East and that they need to support Israel. And this is where the huge American support for Israel came from.
Well, I know, speaking to many Christians who I meet in terms of my work in the UK of reaching out from the Jewish community to those Christians who wish to stand with Israel, that the 6-day war was a major part in the motivation of many of them to stand with Israel biblically and in terms of faith. Many of them come from that generation where they would have been maybe in their 20s or 30s at the time of 1967, so old enough to know what was going on, to have seen and for that to have impacted on them. And I think it's that generation which then goes on to form the pro-Israel ministries that we have today, whether it's Bridges for Peace, Christian Friends of Israel, International Christian Embassy of Jerusalem. You're right to point to that American link. And of course, evangelical Christianity has become a powerful political force in the United States. So you have Christians United for Israel there. So again, the generation, the Pastor Hagee generation, will remember the Six-Day War as pivotal in their own lives. And I think this was a major motivational force in reinvigorating a Christian and biblical support for Israel.
Yeah, and we're down to the last 6 minutes of the programme, which is a shame because I could do another hour on this subject. Stephen, the other important factor to take into account, and this one, isn't it, is that the Six-Day War, we saw clearly the hand of God upon Israel at this time. She faced a war of annihilation, and yet within 6 days she tripled in size. How much can we say that the Six-Day War was actually a miracle provided by Hashem, the God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, the God of Israel?
Well, I wouldn't class myself as a prophet or someone who can pronounce on that. I can only say that it had a profound impact on the faith of millions of Jewish people. We've talked about millions of Christian people. And I think it's important to make a point, actually, that it's not a glorification of war. We've mentioned the length that Israel went to avoid the war. Abba Eban was instrumental in that. He traveled to Paris, to London, to Washington to avoid war. The war cost lives. 800 Israelis lost their lives in the Six-Day War. The number of Arab casualties we'll probably never know for certain, but we're looking at maybe 10 to 15,000. So war is not a good thing, but no one can escape the fact that Israel's victory in that war cannot be explained entirely on rational and military terms. Now, there are a lot of commentators out there who'll say, of course Israel won because it was a better organized state, the Arabs were in disarray. But I think just the fact that there are 2.6 million Israelis and well over 20 to 30 million Arabs in those surrounding countries, and by the way, more distant Arab countries like Kuwait, Saudi Arabia we've talked about, Algeria, they were also mobilizing forces to fight Israel. That disparity in numbers, they cannot, the more kind of secular-minded commentators cannot get around the fact that a tiny country survived this war of annihilation which was imposed against it, and I can't explain it in purely rational or military terms.
And Stephen, how can our viewers play a part in remembering the Six-Day War and the liberation of Jerusalem, and also to actually advocate for the truth of the true historical facts of the time, rather than the lies and the misinformation and the myth that this war was all about Israeli expansionism, and as a result Israel is occupying Palestinian Arab lands?
Well, I think it's very important to know the facts. So I would encourage people to go onto our Facebook page, Six-Day War, 50 years on. Also, if they're on Twitter, they can follow it there. That will give them the day-to-day facts and the environment and the atmosphere of those times 50 years ago. So that's a good basis of information. And I think it's so important in terms of Israel's case today. If the Arab-Israel conflict was all about so-called occupation, so-called settlement, how to explain a war of annihilation in 1967 when the so-called West Bank was not held by Israel, and when Gaza was not held by Israel, it was Egyptian, the Golan Heights. So what is the root cause of the Arab-Israel conflict? I think the Six-Day War is central to our understanding. It is about Israel's existence, its right to exist, its justification of survival and being there. That is the core issue at stake, and I think the Six-Day War is very important. So I encourage viewers to come onto the Facebook page, to like it, to join the group, to follow the Twitter page, and equip themselves with the basic facts.
Excellent. I know it's also important to remind our viewers also what happened in October 1967 at the Khartoum summit where the Arab League met, where they said there will be no peace with Israel, no reconciliation with Israel, and no negotiations with Israel, the three famous no's. So it's very, very clear that despite Israel offering those territories back to the Arabs, they refused them.
Yes, totally. Yeah, unbelievable. It's a kind of one time in history where those who have been defeated try and impose their terms on the victor. But it's, you know, it's a sad fact that yes, the mentality remained on the Arab side of total rejectionism, not wanting Israel on 1 inch of land in the Middle East, never mind the territories. And I think it's also very clear that, you know, the interests of the Arab people, the Palestinian people, not really a concern of Arab leaders. You know, that's all about power politics for them. It's Nasser wanting to be the leader of the Arab world, and, you know, the human interests of refugees, of other people, of no interest in terms of their desire to destroy Israel.
Stephen, I just want to thank you so much for being my guest on today's Middle East Report. I've really enjoyed this programme, and 100% behind your initiative, behind the Board of Deputies and the Jewish Leadership Council in bringing the truth about the Six-Day War and the importance and spiritual significance of the liberation of Jerusalem.
Thank you so much, Simon. Thank you.
Pleasure. And I just want to take this opportunity to thank you all for watching today's Middle East Report. It's important that we understand the true historical facts that occurred prior to the build-up of the Six-Day War, that Israel faced a war of annihilation, and yet with God's help, not only did Israel win that war, she also liberated her sacred city, the city of Jerusalem. And thanks today that there is freedom of religion and freedom of worship in this holy city. So I'm going to leave you with this very moving song in tribute to the brave Israeli soldiers who fought during the Six-Day War.
Today we confronted the air forces of Egypt, Syria, Jordan and Iraq. In this battle we have destroyed approximately 400 enemy planes. Following are the details of the enemy planes that were destroyed. In Egypt, 300 planes, 30 Tupolev 16 heavy bombers, 28 Ilyushin 28 medium bombers, 12 Sukhoi 7 fighter bombers,